The first casualty arrived before the sun did. It was July 1st, 1916, on the rolling chalk fields of northern France. The morning was warm, the sky was clear, and in a few hours, this quiet stretch of farmland would become the deadliest single day in the history of the British Army. The men called it the Somme, after the slow river that wound through the valley. The generals called it the Great Push. The surgeons behind the lines called it something else entirely. They called it the Flood. Why does that word matter? Because the men who treated the wounded that day were not soldiers in the usual sense. They carried no rifles. They fired no shots. And yet they would face a test that few people on Earth could imagine. Picture the place where they worked. It was called a Casualty Clearing Station, often shortened to a CCS. That simply meant a field hospital set up a few miles behind the front, close enough to reach the wounded quickly, far enough to be out of direct fire. Tents and huts, rows of stretchers, a surgeon, a handful of nurses, a few orderlies. On a normal week, they might treat a few dozen men. On July 1st, the planners expected around 10,000 casualties across the whole front. The real number was far higher. The historian Martin Middlebrook spent years tracking down the survivors of that morning for his landmark study, The First Day on the Somme. The figure he confirmed is almost impossible to absorb. On that single day, the British Army suffered nearly 57,000 casualties. Around 19,000 of them did not survive. More men fell in those few hours than in the entire Crimean War, the Boer War, and the Korean War combined. Now imagine being the surgeon those men were carried toward. He had trained for years. He knew anatomy. He knew how to set a bone and close a wound. But nothing in any medical school had prepared him for arithmetic like this. One surgeon, one table, and a line of stretchers stretching back further than he could see. So here is what actually happened that morning. The wounded came in waves, carried by stretcher bearers who had crawled out into open ground to find them. The first job was not surgery at all. The first job was choosing. It had a name, borrowed from the French. Triage. The word came from the verb trier, meaning simply to sort. A nurse or a junior doctor would move down the line and divide the men into three groups. Those who would likely live even without immediate help. Those who would likely die no matter what was done. And those in the middle, the ones whose lives hung on whether the surgeon reached them in time. It sounds clinical. It was anything but. Because triage meant that a man might be set gently to one side, made as comfortable as possible, and left, so that the surgeon could save two others in the time it would have taken to save him. Every doctor who did this work carried those decisions for the rest of his life. There was no manual that made it easier. There was only the count, and the clock, and the next stretcher. What kept them going through hours like that? The historian Lyn Macdonald spent decades gathering the testimony of the people who lived through the Somme, soldiers and nurses and surgeons alike, for her book simply titled Somme. What comes through again and again in their accounts is not heroism in the cinematic sense, it is endurance. Surgeons worked 16, 20, 24 hours without rest. They operated until their hands shook. They drank cold tea standing up, and when they could not stand, they sat and kept working. The nurses worked beside them through all of it. Many were volunteers, young women who had answered the call through an organization called the Voluntary Aid Detachment, or VAD. One of them, Vera Brittain, later wrote one of the most honest accounts of the war ever published, her memoir, Testament of Youth. She had no medical background when she began. She learned in the worst classroom on Earth. And she never forgot what it cost. Here is the part of the story that most people never hear. The Somme was not only a place of loss, it was, strangely, a place of invention. The sheer scale of suffering forced medicine to change faster than it ever had before. Old assumptions broke under the weight of so many wounded, and out of that pressure came breakthroughs that still save lives today. Consider blood. Today, a blood transfusion is routine. A century ago, it was experimental and rarely used in the field. Doctors did not yet fully understand how to store blood or move it safely. But the men at the Somme were dying of blood loss faster than anything else, and a handful of doctors refused to accept that nothing could be done. One of them was a young British surgeon named Geoffrey Keynes. He pushed to bring transfusion directly to the casualty stations, carrying the equipment forward so that a wounded man could receive blood before it was too late. He was not alone. A Canadian doctor named Lawrence Bruce Robertson became one of the war's great champions of transfusion, performing it again and again at the front and proving it could be done under fire. Their work, refined across the long months of the Somme and the battles that followed, helped turn transfusion from a gamble into standard practice. Think about that for a moment. The next time someone you love receives blood in a hospital, the road to that moment runs straight back through the mud of 1916. There was another breakthrough, too. Wounds in the filthy soil of the battlefield became infected with terrible speed. A scientist named Carrel-Dakin and a surgeon named Alexis Carrel developed a method of cleaning wounds with a gentle antiseptic solution, irrigating them slowly to hold infection at bay. The Carrel-Dakin method, as it became known, saved limbs and lives across the Western Front. It was born of necessity, in the same valley where so much was being lost. So the surgeon at his table that day was doing two things at once. He was racing to save the man in front of him, and without ever intending to, he was helping to invent the future of medicine itself. But let us not dress the day in glory it never had. The historian John Keegan, in his famous study The Face of Battle, looked closely at what the Somme actually felt like for the people inside it. He cut through the maps and the grand strategy to ask a simpler question. What was it like to be there? His answer was unflinching. For the wounded and those who tended them, the Somme was a place of confusion, exhaustion, and grief on a scale the human mind is not built to hold. By nightfall, the surgeon had not stopped. The line of stretchers had not ended. New wounded arrived as fast as old ones were carried away. And somewhere in the dark, the stretcher bearers were still out in the open ground, still searching, because the work of finding the living did not pause for darkness. What does a man do when the task is impossible and he cannot put it down? He does the next thing. He treats the next man. He makes one more decision and then one more, because the alternative is to stop, and stopping is not allowed when lives are counted in minutes. The Battle of the Somme did not end that day. It ground on for 4.5 months, into the cold and the rain, until November. By the time it was over, more than 1 million men on all sides had been killed or wounded across that small patch of France. The surgeons treated them all, friend and enemy alike, because a wounded German on the table was, to a field surgeon, simply a patient. That, perhaps, is the quiet truth at the center of this story. In a war built to divide men into us and them, the field hospital was one of the few places where that line dissolved. The surgeon did not ask which uniform a man had worn. He asked only whether he could still be saved. Where can you go to feel the weight of it today? In the village of Thiepval, on the ground where so much of the battle was fought, there stands an enormous brick and stone monument designed by the architect Edwin Lutyens. It is the Thiepval Memorial to the missing of the Somme. Carved into its great arches are more than 72,000 names. Each one belongs to a man who fell in that battle and whose body was never found or never identified. They are not buried there. They are remembered there. Walk beneath those arches and you will not find the surgeons' names among them. The surgeons mostly survived, but everything they did that summer, every decision, every transfusion, every wound cleaned and closed in the small hours of the morning was aimed at keeping names off walls exactly like that one. That is the legacy they left. Not a victory, not a medal, a method of mercy, refined under unimaginable pressure and handed down to every emergency room and field hospital that has opened its doors since. So when the first casualty of that long day was carried in before dawn, the surgeon did not yet know what was coming. He could not have known that the morning would never truly end, that the line would not stop, that the work would change medicine forever. He knew only that a wounded man needed him. And so, before the sun had risen, he began.